Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's talk by Pia Brancaccio. I hope you're all doing well and weathering the current situation with all its challenges. My name is Sanjyot Mehendale, and I'm the chair of the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies at UC Berkeley. Now, this is the first in a series of events, or a series of lectures, rather, on ancient Gandhara, held in conjunction with an exciting new exhibition titled Beyond Boundaries, Buddhist Art of Gandhara, which draws upon public and private collections to bring together images of the Buddha, narrative panels about his life, and important examples of the emergence of Greek heroes as a part of the Buddhist pantheon. Scheduled to be on view at the Berkeley Art Museum from April 2nd to October 3rd, it is the brainchild of Osmund Bopearachchi, former adjunct professor of Central and South Asian art, archaeology, and numismatics at UC Berkeley, and Julia White, senior curator for Asian art at the Berkeley Art Museum. Now let's keep our fingers crossed that things will have improved somewhat by April, and we'll have the opportunity this year to actually see these wonderful objects in person. Now, aside from today's talk by Professor Brancaccio, other lectures in the Gandharan series include, on March 12th, Gandharan Buddhist Reliquaries and Gandharan Buddhism, which is a lecture by Richard Solomon, Professor Emeritus at the University of Washington in Seattle. And on April 16th, Where Was Wine Drunk in Gandhara? New Insights into Reveling Scenes in Light of a Stylistic Analysis, a lecture by Jesse Pong of the Center for Religious Studies at Ruhr University in Bochum, Germany. Now, in addition to the above-mentioned two talks in early March, we'll also be uploading a webcast of a conversation between Osmund Bopearachchi and Julia White regarding the exhibition. Now, for information on these and other events, please visit our website. Now, I'm very excited to introduce Pia Brancaccio, as her earlier work on the performative quality of Gandharan art helped shift the way we look not just at Buddhist visual culture, but more broadly at visual narratives in general. Dr. Brancaccio received a degree from the University of Naples, L'Orientale, in Italy, and is currently professor in the Department of Art and Art History at Drexel University. Dr. Brancaccio specializes in early Buddhist art and cross-cultural exchange in South Asia, with a regional emphasis on the visual cultures of ancient Gandhara and the Deccan Plateau. She has written extensively on Gandharan art. Among her publications are the co-edited volume with Kurt Behrendt, Gandharan Buddhism, Archaeology, Art, Texts, and a number of articles on wide-ranging topics such as classical elements in the decoration of Gandharan stupas, and regional workshops and votive stupas in the Swat Valley, and my favorite on Dionysus and drama in the Buddhist art of Gandhara. Her most recent work has centered on Sri Lanka, monumental rock-cut images from Sri Lanka, New Perspective. New Perspective was published last year in the edited volume, Bridging Heaven and Earth, Art and Architecture in South Asia. She's currently engaged in 3 projects, she tells me, one on monumentality in Buddhist art, dealing with colossal images, materiality, and technology. 2, she's finishing up a study on the Kanari caves in the later period, an examination of esoteric Buddhism in the Konkan, or Konkan as people from Maharashtra would say, Konkan district on the west coast of India. And 3rd, a project on Buddhist visual narratives and performance in early South Asia. In the context of the latter, her talk today is entitled The Narrative of the Buddha's Life in Gandharan Art, Between Storytelling and Performance. Welcome, Pia.
Thank you, Sanjyot. Thank you so much for your introduction, and thanks to you, to Osmund, to Frank, to the Tang Center at UC Berkeley, for inviting me to open up this series of lectures on Gandhara. I'm delighted and honored to open up the lecture series. And I also would like to thank Sky and Frank for their technical help and for their support here. And I would like to thank all of you for being here today in great numbers, I gather, from all over the world. So thank you for sparing an hour or so of your Friday morning, afternoon, evening, to for a conversation on Gandharan narratives and the sort of matrix of the stories of the life of the Buddha in Gandharan art. So let me just share the screen and start right away. The goal of my talk today, the aim of my talk, is really to offer a new viewpoint, a new vantage point from where we can look at the narratives of the Buddha's life in Gandharan art. Now, there are quite a number of studies done on this material, and as you know, between the 1st and the 3rd centuries of the Common Era, Gandharan artists really created a body of narrative sculpture recounting the Buddha's life in a chronological and sequential manner. And it was really in this context, in the Northwest, in Gandhara, that we start seeing some of the representations of the Buddha in anthropomorphic form in the region. So I'd like to open this sort of reflection about the nature of Gandharan narrative with a quote. A quote from what Maurizio Taddei wrote a long time ago on Gandharan narratives. He did quite a remarkable study on the sort of entitled the sort of narratives, Gandharan narratives between India and the Hellenistic world. And among many other things, he remarked that the great diversity of the art of Gandhara in comparison with that of India proper does not consist in its being narrative rather than symbolical, but in the introduction of a type of narration that can be defined as historical and linear. This type of narration is absolutely original compared with Indian art. So rather than really focusing on narrative, he kind of placed the accent and the emphasis on this sort of a historical thread that ties together the life of the Buddha and a sort of linear sequencing of the event, this sort of unfolding from beginning to end of a sort of a biography. Now, there have been some studies done on sort of the narrative strategies of Gandharan art. Most notably, of course, the work by Vidya Deheja, who talks about, identifies the narrative modes of Gandharan art and sort of in looking at the representation of the life of the Buddha. 2 examples are here on the screen, the birth and the beginning and the end, although sometimes the life of the Buddha in Gandharan art begins with a prophecy, with the Dipankara Jataka. But while looking at the way the stories are represented, she points out that these images focus on a linear mode of narration. She talks about monosynic narration. However, today I'm not really planning to look at that. I'm kind of moving away a little bit from this concept of narrativity and narrative strategies. And I also plan to move a little bit away from this sort of interest in linking a particular text to an image and trying to find correspondence between the written and the visual. This correspondence is not always automatic, and scholars have tried and have worked extensively and still are on this particular subject. And sometimes we can't really establish a very close correspondence between the two, precisely because there is another element that I'd like to bring to the table, and that is theater and drama. I'm trying to actually explore the reasons why, the reasons that led Gandharan artists to represent the life of the Buddha in such a radical new way. And I'd like to propose that really the narrative syntax of Gandharan art is rooted in the performative tradition. And so rather than just looking very closely at this correspondence between text and image, I think we ought to give a seat at the table at drama and what role did it play in forging this sort of historical and linear narrative of the Buddha's life in Gandharan art. So I'd like to start by looking at the panels where the narrative scenes are represented. And I'd like to consider for a moment actually the work of art. We always talk about iconography, and we never actually think about the materiality of the object, okay? So these panels where, of course, there was a design, an overarching design, the panels were put together, representing, of course, the stories of the Buddha's life in a sequential manner, and they were attached to the bodies to the drums of these smaller stupas that were crowding the sacred areas of ancient Gandhara. So essentially, you would have these narratives unfolding on these smaller individual monuments. There are also cases of larger narratives, but right now I'm really focusing on those minor stupas and the smaller panels that ring the drum of the stupa. And these panels, for instance, here I bring an example from a narrative panel and from the sacred area of Saidu Sharif in Swat. Swat is in that map that you see on your right, in the area where Butkara is indicated. And these panels were attached in a sequential way. Of course, there are also marks that indicate the succession of the pieces. Sometimes you can find them on the drum of the stupa. They were attached with nails. As you can see from the back, we hardly see a back of a Gandharan relief. So I thought for a change, we ought to look at that too. And you can see nail holes. And you also see the beautiful chisel marks that actually are the traces of the work of this very talented craftsman that really transformed this rock into something that is completely different, to a work of art that captures the life of the Buddha in such a wonderful way. So some of the panels, as you can see here, have two rows, two registers. A bottom register, usually where you see scenes from the Buddha's life separated by pillars. And the top one is also an interesting register because it seems to be really linking the artistic materials to the world of the devotees in many cases. We don't necessarily have scenes from the Buddha's life also on the top register. Sometimes we have scenes that in fact bring us back to celebrations. Sometimes we have, as we will see, viewers. So as the bottom register speaks of the life of the Buddha, the top register, I think, speaks for the life of the devotees and the patrons of Buddhist art in Gandhara. Now, another important part of the context of these reliefs depicting the life of the Buddha is that they were seen probably as the devotees would circumambulate, walk around the monument. However, I must say that if you look at some of these smaller stupas, I guess votive stupas, but in the end, every stupa is a votive stupa, the smaller stupas, you will notice that they're actually built in the sacred areas right next to each other. Sometimes you don't really have space to circumambulate. So this is also another interesting thing that one should think about. However, it seems that the sequence of the life scene follows the rhythm of the circumambulation, and so the biography unfolds from right to left on this body of the stupa. And you can see here three scenes actually on the same fragment, one that is broken, the birth of the Buddha from the right to left, the bath, and the return to Kapilavastu. And again, the top part is something that actually speaks to the world of the devotees, and I think, in fact, may relate to what I will be talking about later, such as drama and performances. What we notice also, it's interesting, this way of arranging the visual is also the way, the Kharosthi script works from right to left. So this idea of really writing and portraying the narrative in this particular sequence is really remarkable. Now, we tend to think about Gandharan narratives representing the life of the Buddha as, kind of straightforward images to interpret. We look at the sequencing of the events, some sequencing is more obvious than other, and we imagine that the narrative is within the reliefs. But in fact, if we think about how many of these pieces have come to us, really the work of reconstructing narratives is not always that easy. We don't have many complete narrative cycles, and this is the condition in which a lot of the sculpture, Gandharan sculpture, has come to us. You're looking at a photograph of the end of the 19th century by Alexander Cady, worked extensively in Swat. And once the sculptures were harvested or excavated, there were some excavations done or collected. They were photographed and then they were sent to colonial museums. So pieces of the same stupa, so narratives that belong together, have been dispatched to different continents today. So there is also this hurdle about reconstructing narratives. And I used as a picture to advertise this talk the image of the Sikri stupa. This is, I would say, a complete narrative with 13 panels that ring the drum of the stupa. But the way the stupa has reached us is also sort of the product of a reconstruction that happened again in colonial period. And the photo that you have here was actually the one of the Sikri stupa, the one that's below, as reconstructed in the garden of the Lahore Museum or in the garden of the Murden Session Court in the 19th century. So a lot of this actually Gandharan art was placed in gardens of public offices during the colonial period. The stupa, as was reconstructed, was actually placed now in the Lahore Museum, but the stupa we see there is sort of a little bit of a fiction. Also, we are inclined to think that the sequencing of the events is right, but of course we know that, the birth comes before the, great departure, and then come of the Buddha from the palace, and then that comes before the Enlightenment. We have some key points in the sequence, but there are a lot of scenes, especially miracles and conversions, that we assume that they go in this order, in the sequence, also because we're using the text, but sometimes that's not so straightforward. So we are looking here at a complete life on the Sikri stupa. And when we look at the series, we have, again, 13 panels, so it's really impossible to show them all. But what we see is that on this complete series with narrative from the Buddha's life, the story literally unfolds almost like a play around this monument. The life episodes are selected and arranged in chronological order, as we said, from right to left, from the teacher's birth to his death and his funeral. And of course, the sequential placement of the images recreates sort of, when the devotee walks around, a spatial and a temporal progression that is really proper almost of kind of theatrical performance. You see a before and after that are clear. There is no ambiguity here. The characters are also well cast, highlighted, so that, they're staged to capture the moral of the story. And really, if we think about these reliefs, they are actually set in between two pillars, almost as if you're looking at a scene that is actually staged for the viewers to engage with. Of course, the Buddha is the main protagonist, he's the hero of the action, and narrative becomes really the exemplum, becomes the example to follow. His life, the Buddha's life, it should be the life of all, an example for the life of all devotees. And of course, he is right there centrally represented, and other characters are sort of presented in the narrative to highlight the moral of the story. Also, there is a very interesting aspect about Gandharan art, and that is that many many stupa, many panels from stupas that depict the scenes from the life of the Buddha include spectators. So and this is very important because it's almost that the panel is choreographed to bring up the idea that we are viewers, that we are spectators. We are sort of looking at the unfolding of the life from balconies, for instance, as we can see here in these two fragments, these two sculptures, one from Buddhist now in the Swat Museum, and one from the sacred area of Chatpat in the Deer Museum. So what we're looking at, in essence, is that the narrative of the Buddha was really designed to have kind of be seen by spectators that become a key part of the sort of the whole conception. And this is clearly a sign that we are looking at a life that is an example that should be imitated, and a life that is performed for all of us to participate and emulate. So this is really something new that the life of the Buddha really adds, that the narrative brings to us. This was not the first time that we are looking at artworks depicting the story of the life of the Buddha in the Indic world. Of course, there were quite a few examples before we actually are looking at the Gandharan material. And one comparison could be obviously the great stupa at Sanchi, where we have an abundance of narrative scenes from the life of the Buddha. And they are placed on pillars of the Toranas, of the four gates. However, there is something about this way of treating the narrative that is very different, because when we compare a Gandharan example of the narrative of the Buddhist life with one at Sanchi, we look at Sanchi and there the before and after are, totally unclear. In Gandhara, there's no ambiguity, and the connection between the various scenes from the life of the Buddha depicted at Sanchi is not really apparent. And scholars have been trying to figure out, okay, what's the sequence, what's the logic here? And that has been a little bit challenging. So Gandharan art really brings, it's completely innovative that way. And this linear and historical treatment of the life of the Buddha is really something that is unique. Another incredibly unique aspect of Gandharan art is the sort of expansion of the youth cycle of the life of the Buddha, and a great interest in the conversion stories, the actual variety of stories that are depicted in Gandharan art that deal with the conversion of Nagas, Yakshas, heretics, so to speak, or ascetics, Brahmanical ascetics, naked ascetics. It's actually quite remarkable. There is a very great interest in expanding those segments of the biography. Well, of course, some others are standard, but what we see, where we really see this sort of creativity of Gandharan art, is in this youth cycle, the conversion cycles. And they are quite interesting. And I think this is some of these reasons, the reasons why there's this great interest in representing and capturing these moments, is probably because they really, these two moments of the biography of the Buddha resonated very well with the Gandharan audiences and with the patrons of Buddhism at the time. For instance, this kind of, wrestling context and archery context, of course, they're mentioned in texts like the Lalita Vistara that has been very much linked to the kind of material, narrative material we see represented in Gandharan art. However, this interest in picking up on these themes is quite remarkable to me. And it also speaks about the fact that these images were actually exemplar for the devotees to follow. And for the patrons, the elite patrons who supported or paid for these monuments, I think clearly identified themselves in the sort of training of the Buddha. This is what was part of the training of the elite, the courtly elite of the time. So they recognize their life in the Buddha's life. And so this connection of the example becomes even tighter. And of course, the remarkable liveliness of images of conversion is another great thing of Gandharan art. And Gandharan narratives. As I mentioned before, lots of conversion scenes, and some of them are actually even extrapolated from the narrative to be represented on false gables. These are pieces that are essentially attached to stupas and kind of mark the front of a stupa, which actually, in some cases, actually breaks the idea of a circular narrative. So we are not, sometimes the sequential order is discarded because we are offering a window into a particular moment of the life of the Buddha. There hasn't been a study on these false gables, as far as I know. So much Gandharan material actually is still, there's so many questions open. And I do think that perhaps these false gables are thematically arranged, that perhaps the stupa that was given with sort of the idea of highlighting perhaps a virtue, a value, in kind of, a sense of one particular practice of, gift, dana, for instance, gift giving, or ideas of conversion. And so these false gables are really interesting because they really kind of highlight the fact that narratives had themes, and there was a selection of scenes to be represented, and also a focal point, which will be represented by this kind of images. But then let's jump in and look at these conversion scenes, because I think they are really the ones that tell us the kind of interest, the kind of dramatic ethos that inspired a lot of representations of the life of the Buddha in Gandharan art. So I'd like to start with this piece, with this story that is a story just because recently has come up again in my kind of conversations. And it's something that they wrote about a long time ago. And I did not really kind of consider the performative nature of this incident represented in the life of the Buddha, the kind of actually comical way the scene was sort of constructed. This is a story, the conversion story of Patikaputta, has described in the Patika Sutta, of in the Pali tradition, and the story goes essentially that it's a contest between the Buddha and the naked ascetics, and of course the Buddha wins, and not only he performs the Yamaka Pratiharya, this miracle where fire is coming out of his fires and kind of water emitting from his body. But at the same time, the naked ascetic is mortified, is sort of humiliated through the magic of the Buddha. And how is this humiliation going? The guy cannot get up anymore. He's stuck on the chair, he's stuck on the stool. And you see him here where he's stuck and someone is pulling him. And in the sculpture on the right, you see someone is trying to actually pull him from behind, someone pulling from a rope. I mean, it's really a comical incident. And in all of this sort of kind of theatrical and comical depiction, in the carving, in the relief from the right, Vajrapani is coming down from this pavilion, almost like a deus ex machina in the Greek theater, coming down, and voila, they're sort of marking this miraculous occurrence and the victory of the Buddha over this naked ascetics. And this came up in recent conversation because I was talking with Tari Schulman, who has been working on the Patika Sutta in the Pali tradition, in terms of, looking just at the text. And he, in his forthcoming work, remarks, like independently from any conversation that we had, before we had any conversation, that this conversion story is actually treated as, constructed as a belief narrative. So a story that includes also folkloric elements. And then he goes on and remarks in his forthcoming work on the Patika Sutta that this actually reads more, the text reads more as a drama than a story. And he goes on saying that, you know, he imagines that actually there may have been a reenactment of a performance of some of the distinctive scene in the text. And in fact, one could suggest that the episode as portrayed is part of this sort of performance. I mean, there may have been a performance of the text. And again, the same could be said for the conversion of Angulimala. This time, we're not looking at sort of a comic kind of episode. We're looking at a dramatic one. So it's interesting that there are these sort of modes that are highlighted by all these conversions. And this one is Angulimala, who's this thief who's trying to, he robs people and he cuts the fingers off the people he robs, and then he weaves them in a mala and he wears that mala that in the Gandharan relief is represented as a crown. The Buddha stops him from committing this one of the, the last crime he does. And you can see here, he's kind of stopping this character who's leaping forward towards him on the left. And you can see him here. And then Angulimala, after that, is absolutely, bows at the feet of the Buddha, recognizes the Buddha's greatness, converts, etc., etc. And here is his mala of fingers. So this kind of dramatic action, the postures are really interesting because it has been remarked that actually today, at some point, remarked that some of the postures, especially the one that's kind of Angulimala leaping towards the Buddha in such a kind of dramatic way, was a posture that was typical of Dionysiac, something that was found in Dionysiac sarcophagi in the Roman world. Regardless, when it comes to Roman sarcophagi, also there we have to say that people have brought in the connection between the images we see on the Roman sarcophagi and the sort of topoi, the classical representation of drama at the time. And so also in the Roman world, images of the sarcophagi seem to have some relationships with the dramatic tradition. And as one of the scholars of this material has pointed out, when it comes to posture and gestures, it's a very interesting phenomenon because what you have here, you have these familiar gestures that went from everyday life to the stage and then to the visual art. So essentially these three elements work together, and the representations of these dramatic gestures in the visual arts in the Roman world contributed to the crystallization of a story, their characters, and the contents of the story. And I like to think that this was actually the case also for Gandharan art, that in fact, we are looking at the way of representing the figures that reflects a performative stage of these narratives, or some of them, that we really don't have that is not very visible, but if we dig, we start finding all this evidence. And speaking of dramatic postures and gestures, what about this panel that is a part of the Parinirvana, where you have this sort of dramatic attitude of, on one hand, the Subhadra, the last person that was converted by the Buddha. He was a parivrajaka, a wandering ascetics, and is there all composed on the right. And look at the contrast with, on the other side, Vajrapani, who's desperate, throws the Vajra and is like in pain. So this kind of emphasis really speaks for the existence of a profound dramatic ethos in Gandharan art. And I think this actually is something that Gandharan art kind of manipulates and takes from the world of performances. So what about performances in the Buddhist world? And I think that this is another very important chapter, because we come to this material with a very, I would say, a Protestant, Protestant presupposition, where no festival, we just talk about text and we talk about art, but, we really are missing the dimension of the Buddhist in practice. And if we think about the Indic world, festivals are part of the life of a religious tradition. And there must have existed in antiquity, and in fact there were. And I was really happy to see that in the, for instance, the recent work done by Vincent Tournier. He published an entry on Shakyamuni of the Brill Encyclopedia, that he devotes much attention to this idea of Buddhist festivals and dramatic performances, to festivals in particular. And he mentions this particular festival that was actually marking the conversion of the Buddha's minor episode of his life, of these two Nagas. And they, in that occasion, he actually, the king invited an actor to come from South India to put on a play of the life of the Buddha, meaning that at the time when this particular text clearly was redacted, there was this tradition of putting a play to celebrate festivals. Some of the festivals were dedicated to important moments, perhaps, of the life of the Buddha, or some festivals may have been also associated with water and kind of agriculture, sort of. And what I also think is very interesting is that there are festivals that are still today, performed in the Buddhist world that mark important occasions. We can think about the Cham dance of the Tibetan world, the performances of the Vesantara Jataka in Southeast Asia. We could think about also the performances of the Maravijaya in Cambodia in occasion of the Buddha Abhishek, of the consecration of images. I mean, there's all these images that are given. What about their consecration, and what about marking the giving of some of these incredible monuments with festivals? I think that is very reasonable. And more references are in Buddhist texts in the Avadana Shataka. We know about, and Winternitz mentions this, we know about this dancer who actually performed a Buddha Nataka, and the Nataka is actually, it's interesting because it's a form of type of performance that is mentioned in the Natya Shastra, and is really the preeminent one, and talks about, and it's described as a form of performance where you have a small group of actors who enact mythical acts of a hero or even a religious figure or a god, and the Nataka emphasizes sort of heroism and heroic things and uses a dignified language. So we do have interesting connections here. We know that there was a form of, performance that kind of followed in the Buddhist world, that follow some of the traditional kind of performative rules or genres that are described in the Natya Shastra. And more references are in the Buddhist texts. In particular, very interesting is the Ashoka Vadana, which is something that can be pinpointed even to the world of the Gandharan sculpture. And I thought this passage that is translated by Strong here is very interesting because it's a passage in the context of actually Mara's subjugation by Upagupta, and Mara, at Upagupta's request, impersonates the Buddha, and then when he kind of appears again in front of Upagupta, then, he in the text is described as emerging like an actor wearing a bright costume, and he was impersonating the Buddha. So this is a really interesting sort of part, because it tells us that, of course, that there were Buddhist plays. There was a reenactment of the life of the Buddha in some context, and in particular in the context of the probably Ashoka Vadana, which is related or attributed to the Northwest. And this thing that shows that, at this point, Upagupta is not worshipping Mara, but the Buddha it represents really speaks for this important presence. And in fact, long ago, Sylvain Lévy, who wrote extensively on Indian theater, noted that some of the poetic exchanges occurring between Mara and Upagupta in this context seem to have been lifted from the works of the playwright Ashvagosha. And in fact, also more recently, it has been noted that 4 actually verses of the Ashokavadana there are verses from the Buddha Charita by Ashvaghosha that have been integrated in the Ashokavadana. So there is really a connection here that goes beyond all the sort of bits and pieces we're talking about, and the visual. We all know about Ashvaghosha, who is really the foremost sort of first known playwright in the history of Sanskrit theater, who authored, of course, this wonderful poem, Buddha Charita, and he was a playwright as well. And it's a figure that is very much rooted in the context of the Northwest. At the time when our images, narrative life of the Buddha was displayed on Gandharan art. And we should, again, bring up these fragments of Sanskrit, a Sanskrit play, the Sariputra Prakaranam, that surfaced in Kizil, that were reflecting the activity of Sarvastivada monks. So it's very also pertinent to our context. And what is remarkable about these fragments is that we have segments in which Shariputra interacts with the Vidushaka, which is the courtly gesture of classical Sanskrit theater. And there was also an interlude that tells us that Buddhist drama really followed the kind of protocol, so to speak, of courtly Sanskrit theater. More fragments of Buddhist manuscripts in the Shoyen collection. And we have this interesting reference that they're studied by Hartmann. There's one fragment that has been then also worked on by Eli Franco and Dieter Schlengloff. And again, the Vidushaka is in them, and this fragmentary text of the play. There is a character that echoes a character that we find in Ashvaghosha's Buddha Charita, and also a character mentioned as the king of Taxila in the Mula Sarvastivada Vinaya. So there are all these threads sort of coming together. And what about the art? Well, so if the Vidushaka was part of this Buddhist drama, we would have representations, or maybe we can find traces of this in the visual material. And in fact, recently, Robert Artl and Satomi Hiyama identified a series of sculptures in stucco as representation of the Vidushaka. And this is really based on the distinctive hairdo of the Vidushaka as a young guy, a little bit young Brahmin, a little bit funny, with these 3 things on the hair in 3 buns, sort of. And the front lock is shaped as the foot of a crow. So this image here in stucco, now in the British Museum, has been identified as one of the candidates for being a possible representation of the Vidushaka. So if there was theater in the Northwest, where was this theater performed? We did not find in the archaeological records spaces that have been recognized until now as being theaters. Of course, Eichenum on the side. And who knows, we were talking before with Sanjyot, and we were talking about even Begram, but we really, until now, we haven't quite identified them for sure. And truly, I mean, theater drama was performed not necessarily in a space designated for it. It could be represented in a palace. It could be represented in a residence. It could be represented also by creating, in a wooden structure. Maybe they built stages or spaces for these performances in wood, or simply, really, it's the curtain, the Yavanika, as it is called in the Natya Shastra, that really marks the background for the stage. And remarkably, the term Yavanika brings us back to the Northwest, because, of course, the term Yavana refers to this Western tradition that was cultivated in the northwestern parts of the Indian subcontinent, and possibly linked to the Western tradition, to the Hellenistic world. So this curtain, named Yavanika in the Natya Shastra, should actually point us to this direction. You see here a curtain on this vase, this vessel fragment from the Metropolitan Museum of Art that represents a Dionysian scene. And I'm not going to go into Dionysus right now, but of course Dionysus is the foremost god associated with drama in the Greek world. And perhaps this is a connection that Dionysian images carry also in the Northwest. But that's something, that I've discussed in part and needs much more time to develop here. And now that we put all these pieces together, what about Western drama again? What can we say regardless of Dionysus? And remarkably, in a recent excavation from Gumbat Balokale in Swat, the site is just amazing. This is a monument that's still standing from the Kushan period. It's one of the spectacular site. Recent excavations by the Italian archaeological mission, led by the Luca Maria Olivieri, who worked there, through all sorts of, times, and worked in a tireless way. He brought to light all these sculptural fragments that are friezes of stupas representing this kind of duets, images of characters who look like actors. They are dressed in Western garb with a tunic. And if you look at the kind of, again, back to our gestures and postures, they really do seem to make reference to some kind of a performance. And the bottom frieze actually comes from the V&A Museum, because part of the material from Gumbat ended up a long time ago in the V&A. So we're looking at all these scenes of this kind of duets of I think, actually actors. And as I was trying to kind of piece these friezes together, I realized that, these actually may well be actors, as I suspected, and compare them to some of this representation of actors that we find in the Roman world, in particular, these paintings from the Villa Doria Pamphili in Rome that are dated to the 1st century of the Common Era. And we can go on and sort of look at these gestures and positions of the body, and it's actually quite interesting. You see here a drawing from one of the painting, and look at the dancing satire, and look at this character from Gumbat Balokale. I actually had a colleague who's worked on this drawings, and so to make more visible the closeness and this sort of satire, who kind of opens up his dress and displays his naked body as he's dancing. It's really, we are looking at specific things that deal with the realm of performance. And here there's even this little detail of the dog that is replicated in this fragment from the stupa at Gumbat Balokale. So what are these images on the columbarium of Villa Doria Pamphili? Scholars have identified those scenes as representing depictions of traveling performers and performances, and they have been recently reinterpreted as pantomimes, performed in domestic convivial contexts, therefore not staged in traditional and conventional theater settings. Now, as pantomimes did not actually have a spoken part, and they were inspired by themes of the Greek tragedy. They were very popular in the imperial time in Rome. And really, it's not unthinkable to postulate an hypothesis that some version of these pantomimes may have been performed in the courtly environments of the Gandharan milieu. Now, it's hard to say, however, we cannot say that for sure, whether these carvings illustrate real performances, pantomime-like performances that were happening in the region, or if they simply reinterpreted visual templates coming from abroad. However, in any case, they suggest a certain familiarity with Western dramatic models, and also suggest that visual depictions inspired by performances were actually in the region were the norm. So to conclude this marathon through visual material related to the life of the Buddha in Gandhara and theater, I really think that these sort of Gandharan narratives were inspired by representational modes proper of dramatic performances. And that's the missing element. And that's why we don't sometimes find this very close correspondence between art and text, because we are completely not looking at another important factor, the reenactment of some of the scenes that may have occurred in conjunction of festivals in the sacred areas of the Buddhist sites, but also elsewhere, other kind of dramas in other settings. And in fact, I hope that I convinced you about that. But regardless, Gandhara was the place where Buddhist drama, Sanskrit drama, and Western performative traditions converged, I think. That's very seems to be the case. We have so many elements coming and present in these different traditions. And I did not talk about the origins of Sanskrit theater or anything like that. But there is a long-standing debate about the genesis of Indian theater, classical Sanskrit Indian theater. And of course, there was in the past a debate whether this theater developed or at least blossomed as a result of the sort of introduction of integrated some elements typical of the Western performative tradition or not. And Johannes Bronkhorst actually in sort of reviewing wrote a very interesting article reviewing the work by Sylvain Lévy on the Indian theater. And he really points that really the Northwest may well be the birthplace of this tradition, or really a kind of cradle where this tradition thrived, precisely because of the convergence of so many kind of different cultural elements. And in fact, if we think about it, drama might have been used in Gandhara as a popular and accessible medium to unpack this exemplary message of the Buddha to a culturally diverse pool of devotees. So I think I should stop here. And I thank you so much for being with me throughout this actually almost an hour. And I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pia, for this wonderful talk. I would like to invite Osmund Bopearachchi, who kindly agreed to be a discussant. We'll also take the questions from the audience, of course. Osmund Bopearachchi, many of you know him by now, former adjunct professor of Central Asian and South Asian art, archaeology, and numismatics at UC Berkeley. He's also a specialist on Gandharan art, written extensively on this topic. His most recent publication, I think, came out last year, When West Met East, Gandharan Art Revisited. So, Osmund, you get us started on a conversation, a post-lecture conversation on this very exciting topic.
So thank you, Pia, for this wonderful talk. Like Sanjyot, we are great admirers of your work. Not only on Gandhara, but also in Aurangabad. Now you're working on Canary and Sri Lanka. You have already 6 questions. So I'll just make two or three comments. Something you said in your talk, it's very interesting. What is there in Gandharan art is recognizing their life in the Buddha's life. So the events are depicted as a part of the Gautama Buddha's life, but these are normally their lives. When you look at the stupa, also I published in the new book, what Gandharan art did was to give a sequential order that you see in Sanjay that you pointed out, although people say it's eclectic. Certainly it's eclectic. But if you look at the South Torana, It's mainly concentrated on the 7 weeks after the enlightenment of the Buddha. If you take the North Torana, it's mainly concentrated on the visit of Buddha to Kapilavastu and the other events. So what Gandharan art did was it gave a logical order from the beginning to the end, as you said, I mean, following the Pradakshina. So it's extremely interesting. As Sanjyot, I'm very much interested in the whole question of theatre. Just to tell you, coming from a Buddhist country, from Sri Lanka, what I have seen in my childhood that we don't see anymore because of the impact of this television and the social media. In every village, people used to perform not the life of the Buddha, at least the Jataka stories. In my childhood, I played in the Vesantara Jataka and the Kusa Jataka, right? So there was no need of a theater. It is just a temporary structure. You have a stage, and we were practicing for 3 months before that whole village participated, and then people used to perform, and most of these things were taking place in the monasteries, not inside the monasteries, but outside. So people normally selected the dry season. So this practice would have been there. I mean, if Aikanum had a theatre, and if the Sanskrit tradition was there in India, there should be a mixture of both traditions, as you said correctly. And also the reliefs that you showed us from Gumbat excavations are absolutely revealing. The problem with the archaeology in Gandhara is people were not really looking for the daily life of people. They were looking at the monasteries, they were excavating the stupas and other structures. We hardly know anything about the ordinary people. So whether there were theaters or not, it's not a problem for me. But certainly there was a tradition of theater. The article you wrote earlier about the Dionysius and also the theater tradition, I think this is something that you can really continue to work on. And I really believe what you said. There should have been really a great theatre in Gandhara, and also as well as in India. I mean, it's wonderful to see if you go to India and also Southeast Asia, Indonesia, people still have this practice of performing. That is theatre. So I have no questions, Pia, just to congratulate you on this work and to encourage you to work further, and it will be great. And looking forward to your future contributions. I think Sanjyot will take up the questions.
I was going to ask Pia whether she wanted to respond.
oh yes, okay, yeah.
Really nothing to respond. I'm, thankful for your comments and for adding your personal experience to this, to the table. It's really important. When we study ancient Buddhism, we tend to forget this dimension so easily. And I think that was a very important part of the religious practice. I think it's something that perhaps we should keep in mind as we work more on this visual material, that there was yet another dimension that hasn't really survived until modern time, but it did exist. And I think more work hopefully will be done in trying to shed more light on these practices. I'm sure there is more in the Vinaya stories and something that we can develop further. Thank you, Osmund, for your comments, and thank you so much.
Thank you, yeah. Yes.
All right, so we have a couple of questions. I guess I'll start with the earliest. When you talk of conversion stories, is this converting to Buddhism from current beliefs or?
Yes, it's mostly the Buddha converting heretics, so to speak. So converting both humans and non-humans, okay? So we have the robber Angulimala, we may have the ascetic, the naked ascetic, who's maybe an ajivika. And then we have conversion of Nagas, conversion of Yakshas. So all these characters are brought within the folds of Buddhism. And I also, something I didn't mention, but I think is really interesting, is like, why this big emphasis on conversion? Why this great focus on converting yakshas and nagas and other kind of religious figures, ascetics and Brahmanical ascetics? And I think this focus on conversion in Gandharan art perhaps can tell us something. We tend to see all this overwhelming number of sculptures and sites and Buddhist sites as the result of a religion that is strongly established. How about we kind of twist our point of view? And in fact, we take Gandharan art and this abundance of material remains as the effort of a tradition to strongly establish itself in a place. And perhaps this theme, recurrent themes of conversion, may carry an echo of the local effort to actually bring the region completely within the folds of Buddhism. And so that this emphasis on conversion is very much something that had a great resonance locally. Yes, so that's my answer to the questions of converting the others into Buddhism, and especially these characters.
You mentioned dignified language. Could Sanskrit at least partially have evolved so that the stories of the Buddha would be told in dignified or sacred language?
Well, it's interesting because when you look at these grammar fragments from the one from Kizil, I think, it's actually remarkable. The Buddha speaks Sanskrit, but the Vidushaka actually uses Prakrit. So there are two linguistic registers in the same fragments, and one is the kind of courtly language, one is the sort of language of the Buddha, and the other is the language of the buffoon, which is the Vidushaka. So there was an awareness of the kind of language that had to be used. And it's more like the tone I meant, dignified language, meaning that using a certain kind of elaborate language, and this is for the Nataka especially, for this kind of place that had the sort of as topic, courtly topics or heroic topics or topics dealing with gods. So I hope that answered your question.
If this lineality is a new expression in India, how can we understand the paradox between the circular process of Indian time and this kind of lila? Almost on Lalita Vistara Sutra, Mahayanists save all the, quote, historic problem with illusion. Thanks.
So, okay. Well, it is linear, and it's sort of, in some ways, it is something that doesn't end there. I mean, we have all the Jataka stories that we actually begin from the Jataka, because in many scenes you find this in many cases, you find the life story beginning with the Dipankara Jataka. So there is this idea that we are looking at a circular yet linear life, at this sort of coming back, but yet at this sort of exemplum. And this idea of the exemplum implies unicity, okay, because it's the one that needs to be kind of reiterated. So I think it's a bit perhaps is a contrast. And of course, one thing that has been brought up is that this linear narrative is something that may have come to the to the region from the Western tradition of storytelling, where we have this linear development. But I do think that this linear narrative actually comes from this sort of notion of performing, where a before and after is always clear, where you focus on the development of the action, and the episodes are almost as, scenes along this sort of path and progression of a life. I was also reading the chat, the next.
Okay. I thought I'd give you the break of reading and then responding.
Yeah, it's like, okay, right eye, left eye.
What about evidence of influence from Indian drama? Might we see any of the rasas in Gandharan images, for example?
That's a good question. And that's something to to consider. I mean, certainly when we look at these different conversion scenes, if indeed they were staged at some point or performed or recited, and with some scenes performed, certainly we do find a sort of comical, and like with Patika who can get up, and then we do find a sort of kind of horror story with Angulimala and the tension of cutting the fingers off the hands. So there are some, in some of these stories, there are some of this, I'm not sure rasas, but moods that are kind of brought to the surface. And I'm not sure whether we can say that we can establish a clear connection with the sort of notion of rasas, but certainly this is something that would be worth exploring. This is something really new, and so it's something to work on and see what we can tease out by looking more closely at Gandharan art with this particular reading key or reading glasses, so to speak.
Is there any evidence of color being applied in these narratives from Gandhara?
In this sculpture? Is that what they're asking? Yes, absolutely. And we do have that. So this, and also gold leaf in some cases. There is a fragment, I think in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, of I can remember what it is, the Bupearachchi, I can remember, with still buckles of gold, but it was, yes. This material was lightly painted. In fact, I showed a lot of black and white images, but it doesn't really make a difference because as it is today, it's mostly gray because the stone used is this schist that is mostly gray in color, except for some schist that is actually green in the Swat Valley. And so, but they would appear more lively to our eyes. And so would the stucco. Some stupas have stucco images attached onto them, and that obviously was all painted.
Is there some kind of evidence that the use of this dramatic narrative art traveled to China as part of the cultural dialogue with India?
Yes. There is some work that has been done recently by Satoshi Hiyama, who worked on the connection. She works on Kizil, and she has looked at some of these representations that we have in Kizil, in some of the paintings, and in some instances she has found very interesting connection. So there are a couple of articles by her, and if interested, I don't remember exactly reference now, but feel free to contact me. And yes, I think that was an important part also for the transmission of Buddhism. Because, I mean, once we think about texts, we are looking at another level of transmission, I think. We are, when it comes to drama or performances, we are really looking at sort of a very good way to introduce and familiarize new of course, convertees with scenes of the life of the Buddha accessible. There are no language barriers, especially if, they may have used, there's a lot of staging. And so I think drama crosses those boundaries more easily so than texts. Of course, art is number one in some ways because you don't need, it's sort of the easiest, but the narrative, I think the dramatic performance, I think, was an important part also, the transmission of Buddhism into China, something we haven't really looked at very much.
I'm wondering if the actual sculptural form of temple sculpture, the friezes, knowing that structures are always circumambulated in a clockwise direction, added to the presentational form, especially knowing the effects of light to the physical structure of the stupa. In other words, marshalling light and shadow, for example.
Yeah, and these stupas have, the round drum, and very often they're sitting on a square base. So, I mean, these square friezes would be marking the edge of the square base. And I think, yes, when you're looking also at these images in sequence, they would be all superimposed. So what we're seeing now, these are segments of a stupa decoration. When we look at the Sikri at the narrative cycle of the secret stupa, we are looking just at the narrative band, but there was more above and below, and that was part of the visual program of a particular monument. One of the problems with Gandharan art, because the material is so dismembered, we have, and it was also dismembered, a lot of Gandharan art was found in conditions of reuse in antiquity. So it's hard to get to reconstruct the whole visual program of a small monument, but that's something that would be really remarkable to do. And if you consider also sometimes the false gable, these friezes, there's also round bands that are ornamental, then a Buddhist life, then the viewers on top of the life of the Buddha in some cases. So I think, and all of that viewed while circumambulating, then we have this sort of, light and shadow. This presence would have been so much stronger. Some of the characters in Gandharan art, if you look closely at the sculpture, they're actually represented in such a way that you can see them really well from this sort of walking perspective, walking point of view. And so they were really designed in some ways to be staged on these small reliefs where, viewed in a certain way and with this particular kind of choreography, if you wish. And light would be a part of it, I think, was an important thing to highlight certain characters and more than others.
You touched upon it very briefly in the context of the next question. These narrative pieces that are now fragmented across many places, are there any current projects that are trying to digitally reconstruct them?
See. But the problem, I think, is money. I think it's really finding this sort of effort to bring together all this material. It would require a commitment. And I think there would be, it would be one, in some cases, this work has been done in groups, okay, in different places. So perhaps this next step would be to actually link all this database, because a few institutions, also academic institutions, have been working on creating databases of Gandharan art, and narrative material, of course, is part of that. So the next step would really to focus this Gandharan, to kind of work together collaboratively to try to link whatever databases exist, and possibly then tease out some of the so much more we would learn from that. So I think hopefully it will happen.
We'll take a couple more and then we'll call it a day. So it's very late also. Osmund is in Europe, so it's quite late there. Getting late. But anyway, what scenes in the youth cycle and conversion stories in the life of the Buddha generally are picked in the Gandharan?
So that's a narrative question. For instance, just to start with one that we talked about, Angulimala. So Angulimala, this is an interesting story, and it kind of occurs sort of frequently in Gandhara. It's sort of unique. There's not many representations of Angulimala elsewhere. And in one version of the story, I think in the Terigata is Pali is said that actually the story takes place in the northwest, in Taxila, I think. So I think some of these yakshas that are converted, some of this, Angulimala, the thief, or some of these characters actually have local relevance. We have, conversion of the Yaksha Tavika, and I think some of these yakshas were local yakshas that were relevant to the Gandharan cultural milieu. I think that's why the relevance of these stories, I think, to the local contexts. It's this figures were locally known, I think, in stories or legends, or they were associated with places where it comes to yakshas.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of questions regarding the Natya Shastra, whether you are considering that in your analysis?
So yes, I mean that it's that also, you know, as for every Indian text, we have lots of layers that make it. So it's hard really to connect the Gandharan material to the Natya Shastra very sort of closely. It's something also I haven't frankly explored. I mean, I'm kind of moving forward, and something that I would have to look more closely. However, that's a critical. I mean, one should really be mindful of the kind of layering of the textual tradition where connecting art with text. And I do think that the Natya Shastra, of course, speaks of a tradition of theater that is also in part reflected in Gandharan art in some ways, and the details need to be worked. I haven't really looked into that very closely. It's another chapter and of this work.
Okay, I'll take two more. According to your presentation, the narrative arts of Gandhara was the result of the Buddha performance. I would like to ask if you have come across the Amaravati School of Arts from South India, which representing the performance-like narrative scene of the Buddha. Do you think there were any links between the arts of the two regions?
So the question was about Amaravati. Oh, yes, there is evidence actually of contacts between the Gandharan world and the Buddhist world of Andhra Pradesh, of the sort of eastern parts of the Deccan. And also there we have this sort of kind of staging of the life of the Buddha. The one thing that really distinguishes the art of Gandhara is this really linear sequencing of the stories, this sort of biography, this sort of, you know, emphasis on the kind of sequential arrangement, this temporal succession of the events. So in the art of Amaravati and Nagarjunakonda, we do have the scenes that are represented there, but they're not necessarily arranged in this chronological order that is so rigorous and unforgiving in a way in Gandhara, except for the false gables that are kind of pick and choose the themes. Other than that, we really see this linear sequence, and that's really the unique contribution when comparing the art of Gandhara to the art of Amaravati or Nagarjunakonda.
Right, the last one. Is there evidence in the Gandharan sculptural record of musical instruments in the theatrical scenes? Anything prominent, such as the aulos in the Roman depiction of Dionysian theater scenes?
There is a lot. I did skip that because that's something that has been, there are representations of performances in Gandharan art. We have dancers, we have musicians, we have musical instruments. There have been studies that sort of have also been done here and there about some of the musical instruments used in Gandhara. But you do have a lot of the scenes of dance and music with, lutes like musical instruments or sort of flutes. They are represented mostly not around the stupas, but on actually so-called stair risers. Now, large stupas in Gandhara were set on a podium, much like the smaller stupas, and you could actually walk on the sort of podium. You couldn't really walk around the stupa on the podium. You'd probably fall off. But again, there is this focal point on Gandharan stupas. So you would actually climb those stairs and sort of be confronted with the dome and with the drum of this monument. And on those steps, you have as stair risers, these panels that actually include depictions of dance and musical instruments. So certainly there were performances that included music and dance and courtly characters dressed in different garbs. So I think there is so much more that I couldn't talk about today. But I think perhaps one of the speakers in the future will pick up on that theme. When I think Jesse Pon is talking about wine, and so maybe in the context of wine, there's a lot of dancing too, and so that will come up.
Now she'll be extra nervous. I think Jesse's actually listening. So
nice.
To all the others, we didn't get to all the questions. There are many, and we'll make sure that Pia has access post-lecture to your questions and your thoughts. So all that remains is to very much thank Pia for a wonderful lecture. Thank you for spending some time with us, and thank you for Osmund for his willingness to serve as a discussant or take part in this conversation on theater in the context of Buddhism. Thank you to the audience. I think we had about 350 people tune in, and I hope to see you. Well, I won't be able to see you, but I hope you will join us for future events. Until that time, bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Thank you.